I was 30 years old when a single sentence at a dinner table cracked my world open. It was supposed to be a celebration, an elegant anniversary party at a mansion glowing with chandeliers and polished silver, but for me, it became a battlefield. His father looked at me across that long mahogany table, his voice sharp enough to slice through the elegant music in the background, and said, "Street garbage in a borrowed dress." For a moment, everything froze. I heard the clink of silverware stop, the faint rustle of silk dresses, and the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. I had spent weeks preparing for that night, choosing the perfect borrowed gown, learning which fork to use, rehearsing polite answers to questions I feared would reveal how different my world was from theirs. I wasn't born into money. I was raised by a single mother in a small Ohio town, where you worked hard or you didn't eat, where a borrowed dress wasn't a mark of shame, but a gesture of love from someone who believed in you. When I first met Alexander, none of this mattered. He was just a kind man in a suit who ordered black coffee with 1 sugar every morning at the cafe where I worked. He looked me in the eyes when he said thank you. That's how it started, not with wealth, not with glamour, but with warmth. But walking into that mansion that night was like stepping into another universe. Everything gleamed: the marble floors, the crystal chandelier, the champagne glasses sparkling in the hands of people who had never wondered if they could afford rent next month. I had practiced standing tall. I had promised myself I wouldn't let anyone make me feel small. But promises have a way of shaking when the ground beneath you does. His mother greeted me with polite frost, his sister, Victoria, with warmth, and the rest of the family with the kind of smiles that said more than words ever could. They asked me where I was from, what I did for a living, a coffee shop, a degree in graphic design, a small town in Ohio. Each answer drew that same flicker of surprise in their eyes. That quiet assessment, not one of us. And then came Maxwell Blackwood, his father, the man with steel-gray hair, power stitched into every movement of his body. He didn't need to say much. His silence already carried judgment. But when he finally did speak, it was like being called out under a spotlight in front of 30 strangers. His questions were knives wrapped in velvet: where I was from, what my father did, whether I'd ever been to Europe. His chuckle when I spilled a few drops of wine on the tablecloth still echoes in my head. I kept my posture straight, my voice steady, though my hands trembled beneath the table. Alexander squeezed me fingers, but he couldn't shield me from the blow that followed. Maxwell leaned forward, his voice smooth and cruel. "You are street garbage in a borrowed dress, and you will never belong in this family or this world." I can still remember how cold the air felt against my skin, how every eye at that table landed on me, waiting to see if I'd cry, if I'd break, if I'd crumble like he clearly expected me to. But something inside me, something old and stubborn, rose up instead. The years of scraping by, of proving people wrong, of surviving things much colder than a rich man's cruelty. I stood, slowly, deliberately. I saw his smug expression flicker with surprise when I didn't run. I thanked him, because his words solved a problem I'd been carrying quietly for months. You see, Alexander thought I was just a barista with a dream. And yes, I worked at that cafe, but at night, I was something else entirely. An investigative journalist, working part-time with a major newspaper, months before I ever met Alexander. My team had been investigating corporate fraud in the shipping industry, and the name Blackwood had appeared over and over again in our files. When I realized who Alexander's father was, I'd faced a brutal ethical choice. I'd recused myself, asked the paper to delay the story, tried to protect someone I loved from the storm I saw coming. But at that table, as Maxwell spat those words at me, the weight of that choice became unbearable. I told him, in front of everyone, exactly what I knew about the falsified environmental reports, the bribes, the photographs, the signatures, the recordings. The room erupted, but I didn't flinch. That night, I wasn't the girl in the borrowed dress anymore. I was the woman who held the truth in her hands. And when I walked out of that mansion, I walked away not in shame, but with a quiet, burning clarity. In the taxi that night, As the Blackwood mansion disappeared behind me, I pressed my forehead against the cool glass and tried to breathe. The lights of the city blurred into streaks, but the words still rang in my head. Street garbage in a borrowed dress. I thought the humiliation would consume me, but underneath it all, there was something else strange. Fierce calm. I had spent years working twice as hard just to be seen. I'd grown up watching my mother clean houses for women who wouldn't look her in the eye, who called her dear with that patronizing smile. I had built my life brick by brick, with my own hands, with no one clearing the path ahead for me. I wasn't going to crumble because a billionaire called me trash. When I got home, my phone buzzed. It was a message from my editor. Got your text. Story goes live at midnight. Are you sure? Yes, I was sure. I stared at the message for a long time before typing the word yes. At exactly 1200 a.m., the front page of the Boston Sentinel changed. The headline was bold, unflinching, and carried the name that had been spat at me across that dining table. Blackwood Industries environmental fraud exposed. My byline was there. My work. My truth. By morning, everything had changed. News trucks gathered outside Blackwood headquarters. Stocks plunged. The story spread to national outlets like wildfire. Maxwell Blackwood, the untouchable patriarch, was suddenly at the center of a storm. And yet, in the middle of all this noise, all the interviews, all the phone calls from journalists and lawyers, I was waiting for one call. His. Alexander. It didn't come that day, or the day after. By the third morning, I was back behind the coffee counter, wearing my apron like nothing had changed. Though everything had. Customers whispered. A few stared. Some left larger tips than usual. Though their eyes flickered with the kind of pity I hated. I just needed to keep moving. To make lattes. To breathe. Then the door opened, and the air in the room shifted. He walked in. Not Alexander. Maxwell. The man who'd tried to crush me with one sentence looked like a different person now. The perfectly tailored suit hung looser on him. His eyes were darker. Heavier. His arrogance had cracks. Mr. Blackwood, I said evenly, standing behind the counter. What can I get for you? A word, he replied. His voice no longer filled the room. It carried weight, but not power. More like exhaustion. My manager tensed behind me, ready to step in. But I nodded. It's fine. I'll take my break. We sat at a corner table, away from the curious eyes of the other customers. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The last time we'd shared a table, he'd humiliated me. This time, it was silence that did the talking. I underestimated you, he said finally. His jaw tightened on the words, like they tasted bitter. Most people do. I answered. My lawyers tell me your reporting was thorough. He paused. A lawsuit would only make things worse, because the truth usually does that to lies. I said quietly. He didn't deny it. He just stared at me. And for a fleeting second, I saw something I'd never expected from him, not respect, but fear. The kind that comes when a man realizes the power he thought he owned isn't his anymore. I came to ask, he said slowly, what it would take for you to step back. Money, a position somewhere. Name your price. My stomach turned. He still didn't understand. I don't have a price. His lips pressed together. Do you have any idea what this will cost? Hundreds of jobs are at risk. The company my father built could collapse. That's not on me, I said. That's on the people who chose to pollute oceans, forge reports, and think they'd never be caught. I just told the truth. He studied me for a long time. His shoulders slumped in a way I had never thought possible for a man like him. My son hasn't been home in 3 days, he muttered. His mother is beside herself. Whatever game you're playing, I'm not playing a game. I cut him off. I loved your son, and if you want to talk about broken families, maybe start by looking in the mirror. He didn't answer. He just stood, straightened his wrinkled suit, and walked out of the cafe without another word. Hours later, there was a knock at my apartment door. I opened it, and there he was. Alexander. His hair was messy, his eyes tired. But when he looked at me, the silence between us was louder than anything Maxwell had ever said. "Hi," he whispered. "Hi." We stood there for what felt like a lifetime. Two people who had been thrown into a storm they didn't create. "I should have told you," I said. "I should have called," he replied at the same time. His voice cracked on the last word. He looked like someone who'd been carrying the weight of two worlds. "I needed time," he said, "to look at everything, to confront my father, to see the truth for myself." And I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. He nodded slowly. "He did everything your article said. And more. I saw the files. I can't pretend anymore." I closed my eyes. The ache in my chest, tightening. "I never wanted to hurt you. Alexander." He stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "But you told the truth. And my father's the one who built everything on lies." We sat on the couch, the same one where we used to eat takeout and laugh about nothing. Now it felt like a place for confessions. "I don't know what happens next," he admitted. "I love you. That hasn't changed. But there's damage. To my family. To us." "I know," I whispered. "But," he said, reaching for my hand, "I'm not walking away. Not if you're not." I looked at him, really looked, and saw the boy who once ordered black coffee with 1 sugar, who made me believe love could be simple. Not the billionaire's son, just him. "I'm willing to try," I whispered. He let out a breath he'd been holding for days. "Then we'll rebuild. Slowly. Honestly. No more secrets." And just like that, in the quiet of my small apartment, surrounded by mismatched furniture and the scent of old coffee, the world began to shift again. Not back to what it was, but toward something real. The days that followed blurred together in a strange mix of chaos and stillness. Outside, the world moved like a storm. Headlines. Protests. Investigations. Lawyers speaking in sound bites on the evening news. Inside my tiny apartment, it felt like I was holding my breath. By the end of the first week, Blackwood Industries had lost nearly 40% of its value. Federal agencies launched formal investigations. Maxwell's name was everywhere. My byline was everywhere. And yet, in every interview, in every article, people kept calling me the barista. I didn't correct them, not because it wasn't true, but because it was only part of who I was. And I had decided long ago that no one else would get to define my worth. I watched the fallout unfold like an outsider looking in. Wealthy families who once whispered behind silk gloves now panicked behind closed doors. Politicians who once shook Maxwell's hand now distanced themselves. The same people who had smirked at me that night in the dining room were the ones calling lawyers, fighting to protect their own names. I told the truth. That was all. But truth has a way of leaving wreckage in its path. When the story broke, I imagined feeling victorious. Instead, what I felt was guilt-heavy, cold, constant. Because for every crooked executive caught in the scandal, there were hundreds of innocent employees whose lives were turned upside down. People who had worked in shipping yards, in accounting, in offices where they knew nothing about environmental crimes or forged reports. They lost jobs, pensions, security. My editor reminded me gently. Maxwell Blackwood hurt those people. Not you. But guilt doesn't always follow logic. That's when I decided to do something about it. Not to undo the truth, but to give the wreckage a voice. 3 months after the article went live, I pitched a new series, The Human Cost. Stories of the real people affected by the scandal. Former employees who lost their homes. Communities poisoned by illegal dumping. Whistleblowers who were silenced. Scientists who had tried to raise alarms. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest. It gave meaning to what had happened. The newsroom backed me. I threw myself into reporting. traveling to small towns along the coast, interviewing families who had fished in contaminated waters, retirees whose savings evaporated, workers who were still proud of a company they thought had done good in the world, their grief, their anger, their hope. It became my mission. Meanwhile, Alexander was fighting his own battle. He had walked away from his father's company. Not quietly, not symbolically. He resigned. He handed back the keys to everything he'd grown up with: the corner office, the cars, the expectation that he'd inherit a kingdom built on lies. And instead, he used his own savings to build something new, a foundation focused on ethical business practices and environmental restoration. He hired laid-off workers from his father's company. He funded cleanup projects. He worked from dawn until midnight. He didn't want to be a prince of a crumbling empire. He wanted to build something honest. We saw each other often, but cautiously, two people with matching bruises, learning how to touch again without reopening wounds. We walked along the harbor on quiet evenings, talking about everything except the storm swirling around us. I can't undo what my father did, he told me one night, his breath visible in the cold air, but I can make sure my life stands for something different. His family, though, was a different story. Evelyn refused to speak to me. To her, I was the woman who had destroyed everything. The scandal, the shame, the broken dinner table. In her eyes, I wasn't a whistleblower. I was the storm. But Victoria surprised me. The sister who had smiled so warmly at me that night became one of my loudest supporters. Over coffee one morning, she said, "You showed more backbone in one dinner than most people in this family have in a lifetime." Her laugh was bitter but real. We needed someone to set a match to the Blackwood fairy tale. And then there were Henry and Eleanor, the grandparents. They didn't blame me. In fact, they reached out a month after the story broke, inviting both Alexander and me to lunch at their quiet estate. Henry's voice was softer than Maxwell's had ever been. "We built this company on principles," he said, folding his weathered hands. "Somewhere along the way, Maxwell forgot what mattered. You forced a reckoning. Jacqueline, it will hurt, but sometimes, pain is the only thing that wakes people up." Eleanor had simply taken my hand. "You spoke the truth, dear, and though it came with a price, truth always does." I left that lunch with a lump in my throat, realizing that for all the cruelty I'd faced at that mansion, not every part of the Blackwood legacy was rotten. 8 months after the scandal broke, I found myself facing Maxwell again, this time in a sterile conference room at his attorney's office. His trial was approaching, and he had requested to see me. Alexander insisted on coming with me. Maxwell looked like a man who had been carved down by consequences. The arrogance that once dripped from him was gone. His tailored suit couldn't hide the weight pressing on his shoulders. "I underestimated you," he said again. But this time, it didn't sound like an insult. Not about the investigation. About you. His eyes flicked briefly toward his son. And I was wrong about Alexander, too. I thought idealism was weakness. It seems I was mistaken. Alexander stood next to me, arms crossed, saying nothing. Maxwell spoke about plea deals, about prison time, about the empire he had built crumbling around him. He didn't apologize, not fully. Men like him rarely do. But there was a crack in his voice when he said, "I thought power meant control, but I can't control this anymore." We walked out of that meeting into the cold air, and Alexander took my hand. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. I nodded slowly. That was as close to an apology as we'll ever get. "It doesn't change what he did." "No," I agreed, "but it closes something." As the wind bit at our cheeks, I realized this was no longer about humiliation at a dinner table. This was about the kind of person I had chosen to become after it. Years passed, but I can still remember the way the chandelier light caught Maxwell's eyes when he called me street garbage, the way 30 strangers inhaled in perfect unison, the way my blood turned to ice before it caught fire. That moment burned itself into me, not as a scar, but as a beginning. In the months after the scandal, everything in my life changed. My name, once just another barista with a quiet dream, was now attached to one of the most significant corporate fraud investigations of the decade. Invitations from major news outlets and investigative programs flooded my inbox. Some people wanted my story. Others wanted to buy it. And some wanted to own it. But the truth wasn't for sale. I didn't take the glossy network offers. I stayed at Boston Sentinel, the paper that had trusted me. The team that had stood beside me. I expanded my work, leading a long-form series on environmental accountability, corruption, and the quiet damage greed leaves behind. My voice grew louder not because I shouted, but because I had learned never to whisper again for anyone's comfort. I started speaking at universities, conferences, small town halls. People would come up to me afterward, not billionaires or executives, but waitresses, factory workers, single moms, people who had been made to feel less than. They'd tell me they saw themselves in me, that I gave them hope, that maybe their voice mattered too. But not every part of my new life was applause and purpose. Some nights, the quiet was heavier than the noise. There were people who despised me, loyalists who believed Maxwell could do no wrong, anonymous threats, hate mail telling me I'd destroyed lives, death threats. Even, it was the kind of darkness that could swallow a person whole if they didn't hold on to something real. My real was Alexander. Our relationship was fragile at first, like porcelain glued back together, not the same as it was, but stronger in the places it had been broken. We built it again slowly, carefully, layer by layer. There were difficult conversations. Nights we argued, days we needed space. But through it all, one thing remained constant. We chose each other, again and again, despite the rubble that surrounded us. Alexander had changed too. He was no longer the easygoing man who floated in the orbit of a powerful family. He had become a man who stood in the fire and made something new. His foundation grew steadily first, a few employees, then docents. They rebuilt coastal communities scarred by his father's crimes, restoring wetlands, supporting cleanup crews, giving laid-off workers purpose again. We lived in a modest apartment near the harbor, not a penthouse. Not a mansion. A place with creaky wooden floors and a tiny balcony where we drank tea at night. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. His mother never forgave me. Evelyn Blackwood clung to the ruins of her old life with iron hands. She stood beside Maxwell during every court appearance, every news flash. She looked at me like I was the bullet that struck the family empire. She never saw the gun in Maxwell's hand. But Victoria Blunt, fierce Victoria, became like family to me. She invited me to brunch, to art galleries, to talk about the absurdity of the rich pretending they were untouchable. They always think the world bends for them, she said once. Then someone like you walks in with a mirror, and they choke on their own reflection. Then came the day of the trial. Maxwell stood in the courtroom wearing a tailored suit that didn't hide the lines etched into his face. Cameras flashed outside like it was a movie premiere. But this wasn't a film. This was his reckoning. I sat in the back. Not as a journalist that day, but as the woman he had tried to break. I wasn't there for revenge. I was there to witness, to make sure the world didn't forget. He pled guilty. Fraud, bribery, environmental crimes. A plea deal in exchange for cooperation. Prison time was inevitable. When he turned and saw me sitting there, something flickered across his face. Not anger this time. Not arrogance. Just the hollow recognition that the woman he had called trash was the same woman who had dismantled everything he thought was indestructible. After the sentencing, Alexander and I walked along the Charles River, the same river where he had once told me he loved me, where everything had felt simple. He stopped at the same spot where the city lights reflected on the water. My father destroyed everything he built, he said quietly. No, I replied. He destroyed the illusion of it. It was already rotting. He nodded slowly. I don't know if I'll ever stop feeling the weight of what he did. You don't have to carry his weight, I said. Just your own. And that's already enough. He turned toward me, his eyes steady. And you? Do you ever stop hearing his voice that night? I inhaled deeply. No, But it's different now. It used to cut. Now it's just a scar. A reminder. A soft wind came off the river. For the first time, in a long time, I didn't flinch. 2 years later, I published a book, not about Maxwell, or the Blackwoods, or their wealth, about truth, about courage, about what happens when someone who's been underestimated decides not to stay quiet anymore. The book became a bestseller. Not because of me, but because too many people knew what it felt like to be called garbage. That night at the mansion became part of something bigger than humiliation. It became the moment I claimed my voice. And on the first anniversary of the scandal, Alexander and I returned to the small Italian restaurant where our story began. He reached across the candlelit table, his fingers brushing mine. "My father once called you street garbage," he said softly, a trace of pain in his voice. I smiled gently, and look how wrong he was. He exhaled, a sound somewhere between relief and awe. "You didn't just survive him. You turned his cruelty into power." "No," I whispered. "I just finally stopped letting people decide who I am." We left the restaurant hand in hand, walking along the same river that had carried us through love, betrayal, truth, and everything in between. And as the city lights shimmered on the water, I thought of every person who'd ever been told they weren't enough, every person who'd ever been underestimated, dismissed, or silenced. This story was never just mine. If you've ever been underestimated, if someone ever tried to break you with their words, remember this: your worth isn't theirs to define. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe. Tell your story in the comments. Let's make sure no one walks through their storm alone.